Hi, and thanks for joining us here on our first afternoon session, talking trout fishing on the Lower Illinois River. So today we're just going to kind of go through the different sections of public access that are on the Lower Illinois, kind of what you're looking for. If you've never been there before, or maybe you've been there and you haven't had much success, and we'll kind of go through the different baits and lure selections that you might use to find some success catching some fish out there and some key things to look for. So we'll use the chat bar throughout the course. So if you have any questions, moving too fast, or just something general, go ahead and type it in the chat bar, and we'll just address them as we go along. Also, going to be adding a few links into that chat bar as we go along, mainly Google Map points as well as some stream gauge data that you want to look at. That's important, especially if you're committing to making a drive. If you don't live in the area, just the Lower Illinois location for most people who live in the two major metro areas, you're looking at pretty good drive. So some stuff that'll help you out before you even get there. So let's go over just kind of what your public access spots look like. So for the most part, you have three public access sites to get on the river, which are going to be right at the base of the dam. The Watts public unit, which is what the Department of Wildlife manages, and then as well as the McClellan Kerr W. May that's down where the river dumps into the Arkansas. So that's really down at kind of the southern end. Gore Landing is down there as well. And those are areas that you can publicly access the river, wade, put a boat in, kayak, things like that to fish. So the most important thing with the Lower Illinois being a tailwater controlled fishery, it is one of our year-round fisheries. So for the time being, we are able to stock trout in it year-round. We do have some moratoriums on stocking in the summer when oxygen levels get too low or the water temperatures get too high. Trout do not do well in water that is over 70 degrees. 72 degrees is kind of thought to be their threshold. And we get average temperatures in that water now in the summertime that are right there in the low to mid 70s. So in those cases, we stop putting trout in, and we, let the ones that can survive and wait for those water temps to drop back down. So the big thing that you got to pay attention to when you go over there with it being a tailwater control is the USGS stream gauge that's there. So I'm going to throw that link over in the chat bar. And basically what you're looking for is the generation schedule. So at this time of year and in most non-flood periods, the flow, the average CFS that's coming out when the gates are off is going to be somewhere between like 70 and 200 CFS, just kind of depending on where it's at, because the water's always falling and rising. And unless it's been completely shut off to one solid level, it's going to kind of go through different deals. But you're going to see in that stream gauge, they've changed the USGS website. So if you haven't been on them, now they have it kind of broken up into where you can break down what you want to look at a little bit easier. And one of the things for the Lower Illinois is it's going to be default set at 7 days. And so you're looking at the past 7 days of data, and then you want to go down to select data to graph, and it's going to default when you pull up that page to gauge height, but you would just want to click on discharge cubic feet per second. And if you click on that, it's going to show you what the CFS is. And down there at the bottom right now, it's reading 70. That's kind of what their low line is. And then 4,000 being the high line. And so when they're at peak generation, when it's reached peak generation before they turn the gates back off, it's going to crest somewhere around 4,000, which is a little bit too much water in there to safely wade. 2,000 CFS is about the highest that it's going to get where you can attempt to wade it. It's going to be moving pretty good. And really the main thing is the depth, not so much the flow. If you've never been to the Lower Illinois before, it's a pretty good Ozark type stream where it's cobble bottom. So it's got a big floodplain that spreads out. So the water is not tightly packed in like it is at the mountain fork when the water levels raise. And so really you're dealing more with depth. If you go out there to wade, it's going to be deeper than what your waders are. And so it's just not really worth the fishing. It can cloud up the water. It also can sometimes start to move temperatures around in the water that can adversely affect fish. So you really want to be looking to fish it when it's at low flow. And so looking back through the past 30 days of data, it looks like for the most part, on most days, they're shutting the water off sometime between like 8 a.m. and noon, which means that on those given days, it takes roughly from the time that they sound the horns and turn the gates back off, it's roughly about 2 hours before it's fished, really in good shape to be fished, hour to 2 hours. And so it looks like that during these weekdays, they've been turning it off and then turn the water back on at about 4:30, which means that the river in the last 30 days has really been fishable from about 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. before they allow for generation again. So that's something to look at. You want to go in there and kind of move the graph around and look to see when it comes to its peak and then it starts to go back on the down. That means they've turned the gates off. How long does it take from the time they turn the gates off from 4,000 CFS to get down below 2,000 CFS? And once it's below 2,000, you can start to attempt to wade it. And then it'll go down all the way to as close as, it looks like right now it's getting down to about 60 CFS some days when it's completely shut off. So ideal fishing is going to be somewhere between 100 to 1,000. That's kind of your range. And typically that's looking like a long period of time, anywhere from 4 to 6 hours of pretty peak fishing that's occurring between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. A lot of times they'll turn it off a little bit earlier on the weekends. They'll have it off by like 6 a.m. or 8 a.m. so that people can get out on the river right after first light. But can't really fish the river if it's flowing too hard. Your trout fishing just isn't as successful. And if you're going to make a long drive to get over there, that's something that really need to pay attention to. So with that, let's start kind of at the dam. So I'm going to throw a link in. These are going to be Google Map points. So this first one is the first public parking area that you can get to. And this is just right at the base of the dam. So bait anglers, fly anglers, artificial lures. This is a really good spot really for bait anglers if you're coming in to go to this parking lot. It limits you. So if even at low flows, these are two pretty deep pools that come right out of the base of the dam. And so if you're going to park in that parking lot, you're ultimately going to have to walk back down the road a ways to even cross the river to begin any type of wade fishing or, not just taking a singular spot. If you want a spot where you're going to sit in a chair, sit on a bucket, maybe just fish a couple of different from a couple of different angles in the same pool or the same run, this is a good place to go to get set up, especially if you're going to fish with bait, some deeper holes and not a lot of snags or hangups. It's just cobble bottom right there that comes out of the base of the dam. So then if you go down a little ways, there's another parking area that gives you access to fish up to the dam, but also you can wade downstream quite a ways. You can get all the way down to the watch unit. And just depending on which place you really want to fish first, you may start off here and then work your way down the river. But there's a couple of good little braided sections through there. The water is all pretty similar downstream when it's at a lower normal flow. Not a lot of channel characteristics. It's just kind of one deep dredged out area. One bank is a little bit higher than the other. So your channel essentially stays on the same side. So there's not a lot of character to it. And it can be difficult, especially to pick apart, with bait. So it's a good section if you're just looking to go for a walk. And you want to go downstream as opposed to wading upstream to start. and you would just kind of fan cast through that section during low flows. You probably even now with it being under 100 when they're at low flow, there's probably going to be a pretty good gravel bar that you're going to be able to walk onto. So you may even be able to do that section for a good long ways without waders. You could probably do it with like hip boots, maybe even knee-high boots, just depending on at what time you arrive. But you can go downstream there. Fan casting, inline spinners, spoons, super dupers, those are going to be kind of your best bet. We get further into this course, I'll kind of go through what my top lure and bait selections are for the Illinois. But I just kind of want to go through and give people the opportunity to ask questions about the river itself, the public access areas, kind of what to expect at each of them as far as accessibility. Each of them provide different opportunities for different types and ages and physical abilities of anglers. So the next one down is the department's property, and this is the watch unit. And down here at the watch unit, there's also a restrictive zone where you need to use barbless hooks and artificial lures only, and you can only keep one fish that is over 20 inches. So it's a kind of a restrictive zone, but it is a walk to get down there. And if you click on that Google link and it's going to show, it'll say Lower Illinois Public Fishing and Hunting Area. Just downstream of that, what should populate on your map if you're zoomed in a good ways, it's going to say USGS 07198,000, and that is the stream gauge that's there. And that was the link from that water data monitoring station that I put up in the link or the chat bar earlier. So from the watch unit right there. So kind of the trickiest part here for fishing really at any level, as it gets to a lower level, it's a little bit easier to cross. But when you get into that parking lot, you're going to have to walk down a trail downstream. And you'll notice on the map there, there's kind of an appendage of like an island that comes out, and that path winds its way down there. Well, when you get down to the end of that, when it's at low flow, on the Google map of the link it showed, it's going to show backwater that's in there. And you can actually watch that fill up. So as the water levels drop, once it gets down below a certain CFS, that actually goes completely dry. So it stays dry when you're at your normal water level, when you're out there fishing for trout. So when you get down to that point, if you have waders on, maybe even muck boots, you can kind of get down into that area and you can cross straight across the river there. And then you can go upstream and walk all the way to the dam. Anybody with waders for sure can make it all the way to the dam. And if it's down at 70, 100 CFS, probably be able to do it in muck or hip waders without getting above that. And then you can wade downstream. So wading downstream, you really need a good low flow. There's kind of a gravel bar right where the USGS stream is, or where that gauge is at. Downstream from that, you start to lose a lot of the characteristics of the channel bed again. It kind of widens back out. And even at low flow, it holds quite a bit of water. So if you're wading out there, you start to kind of lose a defined side that you should be walking on just because of that cobble bottom. It's very uneven, but at a similar depth. So it's just hard to navigate downstream from about right where that USGS stream gauge is at. So, but that is such a good stretch of river. It's usually one of the most productive stretches for trout all along the parking lot side wall. So that's where the main river channel is at. You get a couple of good bends as it comes down from the dam through the section that doesn't have a lot of character. It kind of comes through a little chute and hits a corner right there. And then it runs along a wall that's just got a ton of structure on it, lots of laydowns, just lots of good habitat. And that current kind of pumps through there. And it's a good section to hold like a fair number of trout. If you're going to, on really good days with like a rooster tail or a super duper or a woolly bugger, even bait fishing right there, you can get into pretty significant numbers of fish, especially during those low flows. As you kind of go downstream, there's a couple of more kind of trout-like sections that you get a lot of characteristics of a riffle, pool, run, tail out section before you get down to the USGS. And that's all what you're looking for with these trout. They're just looking to find areas that um, are going to provide easy food sources. So, with the lower Illinois not being a reproductive stream due to water temperatures, lack of habitat, and then rising and falling water level, they're really it's unlikely that successful reproduction has ever occurred on the lower Illinois just due to generation schedules. Reds would not be able to develop in an area where they would either A, lose too much water, or B, get too much water and have the eggs flushed away. So you can get carryover trout. So these fish that get stocked on years where water temperatures don't get too high, those fish are able to, last until the next year very healthy. So you could end up with a fish that could live in this river for several years. And at that point, that fish is going to be more adapt to its surroundings and provide a little bit more of a challenge as far as what it's eating, how it's eating. For the most part, though, you're looking at fish that are stocked. They're coming from a hatchery. They're very dependent on eating, hatchery pellets, fish food, things like that. So they haven't really had to hunt in their lifetime, and they really haven't been prey. They've been living amongst other trout of the same size in ponds, getting fed. So it's been a very easy life for them. So when they get into these bodies of water, there's lots of stressors that immediately go into their life. And biologically with fish, stress is not good. It can cause them not to eat. It can, cause death and things like that. So as they get into the river, you really got to kind of target them in the simplest of ways, things that they're used to, which for most people, that's going to be power bait fishing, either with power bait dough paste or utilizing some type of power bait or gulp or other brand that has floating either eggs or paste or marshmallows, something like that, and just wrapped around a really small size 10 to size 14 single point or treble hook, fished with weight off the bottom. That's just that anywhere you go trout fishing in Oklahoma, that is immediately going to put you in position A to get the most bites right off the bat. It's just fishing off the bottom with bait. And then for those who, you don't like the sedentary fishing aspect, you'd rather get out there and wade and move and make lots of casts and things like that, then looking for simplified baits that could mimic lots of different prey items. You're not trying to match a hatch. You're not trying to key in on a very particular type of bait fish or crawfish or things like that. You're looking for just very earth tone type colors of inline spinner super dupers, which for the most part is going to be things that look like this. You're going to have your inline spinners that are in some type of brown or olive green with gold, super dupers, which are shaved pieces of metal that are going to come in gold that have a little bit of flash to them. And then you may even look into using things like spoons or slabs that have, just gold or silver, or bronze. But gold seems to be the breadwinner more often than not for flash for color in Oklahoma for trout, more so than silver. It's not to say you're not going to get bit or catch fish with those. Gold just more often than not seems to get bit a little bit more often and finds more fish. So just very basic baits like that, cast and retrieve, sitting on the bottom. And then there is the opportunity at the Illinois that there are some fish that are bigger, that have seen more, that have survived and have that carryover effect. And then bigger, more advanced type baits like you could utilize like Rapala, Rip Shad, things for like bigger, more aggressive trout, big articulated flies, or streamers or woolly buggers, things like that, you're going to attract those bigger, more wild fish that just have more of aggressive appetite, are really looking to key in on things like that. But most of these stalker fish that are 8 to 14 inches, you're going to catch them all day long just using little flashy pieces of metal that are in some type of gold or some type of inline spinner, but really hard to outfish power bait off the bottom in any of those holes or runs. That's just kind of how it goes. That's what those fish are looking for. Um, are there special regulations for lures power bait on that river? Yeah. So there is a very short section of river from the USGS stream gauge downstream. It's listed in the trout regulations. You can go to our website, wildlifedepartment.com, and just go to trout fishing regulations, and it'll show you on kind of a clip art map of what that section is. But if you go to Google Map and from the watch unit, you zoom in, you're going to see that USGS gauge, so you know where it's at. Just think of anything that you could potentially wade to downstream of that, because you're not going to really wade all the way through that section. That'd just be too far in one day. Anything downstream of that, it's barbless hooks and it's artificial lures and flies only. So downstream of that, you can't use bait and you can't use barbed hooks. And there is a special limit on the number of fish you can keep. You can keep one, and it has to be over 20 inches to keep it, I believe. But yeah, so that's the restriction. Other than that, upstream of that, and then downstream at the other public areas that I will link to now, which are our McClellan Kerr Wildlife Management Area. There's a couple of ways into that. So the north area on the river, and again, these areas down here, they're probably going to have some trout at this time of year when the water temps are colder and fish can spread out, get farther away from that dam. And then as a year-round fishery in the summertime, that water warms up. They're going to go get probably closer to the dam, get more oxygen, more flowing water, get stagnant the closer you get to the dump in with the Arkansas. But the spots they're here in the wintertime, you may find some trout that have moved downstream, found better feeding grounds. And then here is the other access road in at the southern boundary. These areas down here, the river bottom is a little bit more silted in. The roads are not very well maintained on these properties. So if you don't have four-wheel drive or something like that, you may not want to try to go in, especially during any type of post-rain. The other public area down there is Gore Landing, and here's the link for that. But down here, you know, it's just something, maybe if you fish the river a bunch and you're just looking for a new public place to go, you may not have known that these areas were down there on the southern boundary. But they are public access, and most people come here during the spring and the summertime, catch white bass and catfish, and striped bass is a good spot to be at if you want to get on the river with a little bit more room to spread out. On the wildlife management areas, when the water is at low level, you can walk the banks pretty far. But as far as that goes, that's kind of your stretch of river. I get asked sometimes, you know, is it worth it to take a kayak in there? You know, you could do a kayak and float your way down to, let's say, like a Gore Landing. That's quite a few river miles to get down there, especially if you were to put in at like Watts or at the dam. You could do it. You'd be doing a lot of paddling, and would it be worth it as far as getting into trout? I think that on the lower flow, catching it on a descending flow, but not all the way at the bottom, basically probably putting in as the water stops, so that you can kind of get a move on down into an area that doesn't get accessed as often because it is surrounded by private land. In that case, you know, if you were to be artificial spinning equipment or bait casting, spin casting, throw in super dupers and spoons and rooster tails from your kayak and being able to float through that, you'd probably be able to get into quite a bit of success, just because you're looking at non-pressured water. Most of these parts of the river are accessed during the summer months in outboard motor boats when the water is high, when people are striper fishing. So as far as trout fishing goes, there is some untapped potential of fishing through there, especially if you can float it. Because like I said, it is there is some private land that is through there. So, um, in order to get all the way to the public area where you'd need to take out at, but you could do a Watts to a Gore landing. You would just need to be prepared to paddle for sure. You'd want to really have that tuned in either on your Google Maps. There is service on the river there. So utilizing a GPS service, making sure you're keeping track of time, especially in these winter months. If you were to get in the water, lots of things that can happen. Water's obviously cold, don't have as much sunlight. So you may think about doing a trout float trip maybe later in the spring before the white bass run begins and the stripers really get in there. That might be the best time to take a float approach to getting down the river. But those are your public access sites. The watch unit is definitely more of you got to be a little bit more physically abled. There isn't good bank fishing access. You can take the short walk when the water is down at its lowest level and get down to the riprap, and there's a little gravel bar that basically dries that you can get to, but the water also is pretty low through there. So unless you're willing to fish from the riprap where the river channel is at, which again, it's can be dangerous being out on riprap, and there's no fishing platforms and it's uneven, primitive terrain. So if you're looking for a place where you can have really just good access, if you got kids or maybe you have a physical disability or something like that, you really want to look at the lower parking lot, public access up by the dam. That's going to give you kind of a beach area. Depending on the water level, with boots, there's a couple little holes, but that's really the prime spot to go if you're looking to just fish for bait. Not move a lot, sit in a chair, maybe have a picnic, family outing, something like that. That's going to be the best bet at the lower Illinois. As you get farther downstream, the river gets more dangerous. There are more impediments. There's deeper channeling. There is not well-defined banks. You have to actually physically get in the water first to find those gravel bars. They don't exist from the parking area. So you do have to do some walking beforehand, which is something that I think gets overlooked sometimes at the Illinois, especially from the watch unit, that it doesn't just have easy access right down onto the water. There is some uneven ground and there is riprap and there are changing water levels that are going to affect the safeness of the area once you get there. So key things to pay attention to for sure. We got another half an hour on here, so I'll kind of talk about our just different lures here that I had mentioned and your bait setups at the top of the chat bar. I put the links to the courses that we've recorded the last couple of days. So I'm just going to go over what are just your absolute best out of the car, out of the box, get rigged up, go catch fish, whether you're going to catch and release or you're going to catch your limit to eat. These are going to be just the simplest, quickest ways, more times than not, that are going to get you that successful fishing bite, have the opportunity to limit out on fish, or just have a good day of catching and releasing and getting into a bunch of fish in the areas that we kind of just talked about. So again, feel free, please utilize the chat bar if you want to talk about a certain section in the river while we're doing this. And I'm just going to kind of go through your basic rigging setups. So obviously I talked about the first being just power bait or some type of dough bait that is some, trout, salmon eggs, marshmallow, dough paste, whatever is labeled for trout. This is going to most closely mimic what they were eating prior to being stocked into the river. So they're going to look for scented things that are pellet shaped that, they're going to go eat. It doesn't mimic anything in the wild. You're not doing anything, biologically with this, like we would talk about in most of our Asking Anglers with fish, where we're trying to mimic certain prey sources. In this case, we are mimicking a prey source, but it's an artificial one. So the two things you're going to need at low flow in the lower Illinois, you shouldn't need more than just a 1/4 ounce casting weight. The less weight that you need to use, the better always when trout fishing. So if you can hold the bottom with an 1/8 ounce weight as opposed to a 1/4 ounce weight, definitely take that route. I always keep, a few different sizes of casting weights: a 1/8, a 3/8, a 1/4, um, and usually if you just stick with your increments of 4, you're going to find something that you need. You should never need more than a 1/2 ounce of weight. If you need more than that, the water is probably too high to be trout fishing. Um, the thing about this bottom bouncing setup is the one thing that is particular with trout fishing with bait, and with this principle can be applied to most species of fish, is they don't really care so much about your hook. So if you think that the hook point, if they feel the hook point, that that's going to be something that's going to affect them, they're used to eating stuff that has pinchers and barbs and gill plates and all sorts of sharp things that they can feel in their mouth. What gets them is the tension. When they feel that stress, that pressure that's fighting against them when they're hooked in the mouth or hooked in the side or however they're hooked up, they're trying to just escape, and that's where you get the fight of the fish. But the same can be said when they're actually biting. So when you're fishing with your bait off the bottom and they're coming in, they have conal shaped mouths as opposed to your sunfish that can open up and it's like a vacuum and it sucks it in. You're dealing with a conal shape and they're having to bite on that bait to get it to the back of their throat. And they're using their tongue patch and they have little teeth and they just work their way along and they try to get that in. It's not going to be like a catfish or bass where you're floating cut bait or something like that, and they come through and hail it, and all of a sudden your line just starts going away from you. That is almost never the case with trout. And so they're going to peck on that. So if they can, the purpose of using a casting sinker, how we're going to do this is so that the fish cannot feel the tension. They're not feeling that weight and getting the kickback when they're biting. So you're able to just indicate with your rod that you're getting bit. So you're going to get more successful hookups. You can put weight on your line attached to a swivel. You could anchor it down somehow. So when that fish is biting, it's also pulling the weight and you're going to get bites. What's going to happen more often than not, though, is that fish is going to get spooked from the fact that when it was trying to get that pellet in its mouth, instead of just being able to freely take it and work it into its mouth, when it went into its mouth, that weight forced the pellet back towards out of its mouth, which is going to spook them when it's fighting back like that. So what you're going to do is we're just going to take a casting sinker like this, and you can put it on your main line. What you're looking for when you go trout fishing is a size 8 up to like a size 14 hook, 8 being the biggest, 14 being the smallest. And you could use some type of treble hook especially if you're looking to keep fish and you don't really care if you gill hook them or what, because you're going to keep them and clean them and eat them, then go with the treble hook. If not, if you might release fish, either because you want to catch bigger ones and you're only looking to keep bigger sized fish, or just because you want to catch and release, then you want to go with something that's labeled as a salmon and egg hook or a mosquito hook or an octopus hook. But a size 8 up to a size 14 is what you're looking for. So if you're going to go with the treble hook, you're going to want to put your casting weight on your main line first. So when that line comes off of your rod tip, you just take that line and you're going to thread it through the eye hole of the weight. And then you're just going to set the weight down. You don't need it. Just leave it on the main line if you were using the treble hook. Now, if you're using the single point hook, you could actually tie this on first, because you can slide the eye hole over the hook and move it up the line. So now that we'll get our hook, get that tied on. So if you get your hook tied on, now you're good with that. And then we'll have our weight. So then all you need next is a piece of split shot. And you're looking for a piece of split shot that is really small. It doesn't need to be very big. The smaller, the better, actually, on it. And what you're looking to do is the hole right there. You want a piece of split shot just big enough that when you put it on the line, that the eye hole cannot slide over the top of it because all we're using it for is our depth. The weight is to throw it out there, get it to the bottom, and the split shot is to determine depth, but we don't really want it weighted down. So the smallest piece of split shot you can use to block that hole, the better. And that's all it's doing. And then to where our hook would be, right? That's how far it's going to go when it gets off the bottom. So this is going to land on the bottom. You're going to reel up your slack so that it's tight to the tip of your rod. And as you reel up, eventually it's going to find that split shot. And when it gets to there, it should be held on the bottom. So you should start to be able to pick up your slack. And then your line back to your rod tip should look like that all the way to the rod tip. Then your marshmallow or piece of dough bait or power bait or salmon egg is going to slowly float up because it's a floatant. And then depending on how far you have that piece of split shot away from where your hook would be is going to be your depth. So somewhere between 8 and 16 inches is plenty. You don't need to be 3 feet up off the bottom because that would be very difficult to cast because you're going to need 3 feet of this before your rod tip. 8 inches is usually pretty good. 8 to a foot, but you could go up to about 16 inches if you're fishing in a really deep hole and maybe you wanted to get it up off the bottom better. But that's all you're looking to do. And then when you go to put your power bait on, this is another place where you can create barriers to your success as far as successfully turning bites into hook sets. Because if you do all this correctly and you get this rigged up, this is going to be your fastest way to get on fish right when you get on the river. Anywhere where you trout fish here in Oklahoma, whether it be a lake or the lower Illinois or Blue River or Mountain Fork, setting up. So the next thing is your power bait or your marshmallow. If you have something like this, some salmon eggs, or you have a marshmallow, then all you want to do is just slide that on. It's already preformed and just cover your hook. You can't take less away or more away. If you're using the paste, you're the one who's determining how much actually goes on. So you're just really trying to get just enough to get a daub on your fingertip. And then with the single point hook or the treble hook, we'll use the treble hook here. Just pick one side to press that paste up against, and then just start to form it around the rest of the hook. And all you're trying to do is just form around the hook point and the eye guide until you get to a oval or an egg or a teardrop shape. Might depend on what type of hook you're using, how you have to bend it. But all you're trying to do is just get enough to cover the hook point. And then that's going to float right up. The thing is if you put way too much on there, where it's like 5 times the size of that, and your hook is essentially in the middle of, a big, something that's 5 times the size of that hook, what will happen is that fish is going to peck, peck, peck. You're going to go to set the hook. There's going to be so much dough paste in the way that when you go to pull it out, the dough paste is actually going to serve as an inhibitor for your hook points actually catching the fish's mouth. You're going to pull that hook out of its mouth without catching any of the flesh on the inside to set the hook. And then what also can happen is that if a fish comes over to start pecking at it, it's going to peck, 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 and it's going to knock that bait off of the hook because there's so much that it's able to get some leverage on one side. It'll create a crack in the power bait, and you'll be able to suck it right off from where the eye hole is at. So those are the 2 kind of common mistakes when you're going to use, a paste where you have to put the bait on around. But you could utilize marshmallows or something like that. You're just trying to cover the hook point. That's all you need to do. And then when you get it cast out there, the next most important thing is just making sure that you get the line tight to your rod tip. No slack whatsoever. If you have a slight bend in your rod tip, like it looks like a little mini, kind of like you have a bite, that's going to be even better. That means you're nice and snug on the bottom. So that means when a fish comes over, it's going to knock that weight loose. And it's either you're going to get 2 types of bites. Your line's either going to go from being taut to kind of pop, and it'll be slack, and the rod tip will hop up like this. And that means something hit it coming at you or picked it up and dropped it. Or you're going to get that fish is on it, and your rod tip is going to get the subtle thump, 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 thump. And what you want to do when you're bait fishing, if you're not holding on to the rod, and I don't recommend holding on to the rod when you're bait fishing for trout, just because you're going to move, which is going to move your line. and you're going to create slack, and that's the one thing that'll hurt you with the power bait fishing off the bottom is slack. That way that fish is going to peck that line clean, and you're never going to know that it was there. So keeping a tight line. So the easiest way to do that is either by finding a stick that's around, preferably one that's got a split branch where you can break it down and create a classic Y shape, so you can set your rod between it. Rod holder, or like a lawn chair or something where you can prop it up alongside the arm, just so you can keep one constant thing. If you're holding on to it, you might turn your head or move, knock it in some way, and you're just going to be creating more work for yourself. But keeping that line tight, that's going to be the most important thing you're going to do when you're bait fishing. So with artificials, if you go out there and you're looking to use a spinning equipment or bait casting equipment or spin casting equipment, you're probably going to want to look to use spinning equipment or spin casting equipment, unless you're really dialed in with your bait caster, because we're looking to use really light line, really light baits, and getting a bait caster that is built in a way that's a medium light action where you're going to get the rod tip to snap and work with you. You probably want to elect, for just convenience sake, utilizing a spin casting or spinning setup when you go fishing for trout. So what you're looking for is a light action or a medium light action rod when you're using any one of these lures. You could use a medium action with like 6-pound test. You're just probably going to deal with a little bit of line lash occasionally. You're going to get the twist or line jump just because you let go of that tension either a little too soon or a little too late, and it doesn't load the tip of the rod to throw that real light bait, and that line jumps right off. What will happen with the spin caster is, instead of getting line lash because it's inside of the case, you're going to get to where you go to throw and you're going to throw it straight down into the water or the dirt or wherever you're standing. So looking for a light action, medium light action rod paired with all the way as low as 2-pound test up to as heavy as, with spinning casting equipment, it probably comes pre-made a lot of times. So it's already spooled. That's probably going to be 10-pound test. That's going to work if that's all you got. But ideally what you're looking for is 6-pound test. 4 or 6-pound tests are going to be your two best lines. 6 allows you to not have to play the fish quite as hard. You get a little bit more break strength. So if you get a bigger fish with a light action rod or a medium light action rod, you got a little bit more leniency of not snapping that fish if you make mistakes when reeling it in. So that's kind of the ideal setup. But you can go as low as 2, as heavy as 10. If you're going to be on the heavier side using lures, because we're using 1/8 of an ounce at our heaviest, and all the way up to like 1/24 of an ounce, 1/32 of an ounce at the lightest, you really want to look for having that lighter line. It's going to lighter line with lighter baits. You won't get the line lash. It'll tow it. So if you're on the heavier side, 6, 8, 10-pound test, stick with 1/8 of an ounce. Don't even, especially if you're new to fishing or you're not as confident in your casting, 1/8 of an ounce, you're going to be just fine. If you go down to a 1/16 of an ounce, you're going to be able to make good casts, but you're probably going to start to see some of the line lashing. If you're 6 pounds and under and have better casting ability, or you're using that 4 or 2-pound test and you're new, or you're still learning how to do casting, you're going to be able to throw a 1/16 of an ounce with that with no problem. That the weight won't be the reason why there's line lashes. So just something to keep in mind. These baits are designed to be thrown on certain pound tests with certain type rods, just for the sake of getting them into the water. Now, once they're in the water and you cast them to the right spot, it doesn't matter how, like, what your equipment is, because at that point, these baits are so easy to fish by just straight retrieving them in that you're not going to get any of the issues that you had when trying to just get the bait there casting. So with any of these shaved metal baits, so Castmaster, which is a slab, Castmaster is the brand, they're little kind of short, fat slab. Generic brands are going to be a little longer, a little skinnier, but it's basically a shaved piece of metal that wobbles erratically in the water and creates a nice flash. Same thing with the spoon. wobbles even more erratically with a wider wobble. With that concave, it falls a little bit lighter on the way down. Sometimes fish will strike this as it's falling. It looks like a dead bait fish. You can jig both of these. You could cast them out, let them fall down to the bottom, flip your rod tip from 3 p.m. to noon over and over and over again, and picking up the slack each time, and have fish hit it on the fall. It's just not necessary. And you're creating, opportunities for there to be barriers in your success by doing that. If you just cast these straight out, preferably 45 degrees upriver, cross current, and then steadily retrieving them with just a straight retrieve back to you. By the time they get midway with you, when they're halfway back, they should be about even with you in the water column. So that means they've been in the strike zone from the time you cast all the way to when they get even with you. From that point on, as they come back to you, they're going to start becoming downstream or even, but coming back at you at a faster pace with tension, which means they're going to rise up in the water column, which is why we don't want to cast these downstream. If you cast them straight downstream, you could let them fall to the bottom, but by the time you start reeling, it's going to almost immediately try to shoot straight to the top of the water column. So you're just pulling yourself out of that strike zone. And the whole point of, artificial fishing is just to stay in the strike zone as long as possible, which is going to be casting 45 degrees upriver, straight steady retrieve from the time it hits the water. And then as it gets even with you, its speed is going to pick up as it catches the tension, and you're not as quite on slack. But the great thing is you're reeling them straight in. Rear facing hooks on all these. Predator fish like to attack from behind and below. And because this will hang in the water like this and it moves any which way the fish decides to take a bait like this, it's going to throw that hook into its mouth or near its mouth. So real high hookup rates with shaved metal baits. Like I said earlier, I'm partial to the Super Duper for my metal bait of choice. A 501 is what I like, but a 502 and a 503, the bigger models, are going to be more like that 1/8 of an ounce. So if that's something that you're going to throw, then you're going to want to look for those, bigger profile lures. But Super Dupers aren't labeled by ounces like all your other baits are. They're labeled by 500, 501, 502, 503. So 500 is going to be on the smallest end of the spectrum. 503 is going to be on the more like 1/8, 1/6 ounce level. So that's what you're looking for. They make all these spoons and slabs and Super Dupers. They come in silvers, bronzes, and golds, and then they'll have different types of color patterning with them. So you can try any of them. They're all probably going to find bites along the way. Just seems more often than not, gold just is the one color that you just get bit on a little bit more often. And these courses are all about trying to set you up to get as many bites as possible, to have as much success as possible. There's obviously different ways to catch different types of fish, different sizes of fish, and how you target it. We go with kind of the kitchen sink approach of, we want you out there getting as many bites as possible, because the more bites you get, the more chances there are for that bite to be a really big fish some of the time, which is part of the fun of fishing. You want to be able to go out there, catch a ton with the opportunity. Quantity mixed in with quality, as opposed to going just straight for quality and maybe limiting your quantity. So if you are looking just for quality fish, utilizing bigger equipment, looking at things that only a big fish could eat. You can still catch that monster fish on a fly that's the size of your, smaller than your fingernail and your pinky tip. But if you're only throwing a big, like Rapala rip shad or some type of, large jerk bait or big, long articulated streamer or flesh fly that you're going to throw, that only a fish of that size could inhale, then you're going out there strictly looking for quality, and immediately limiting quantity. I'm a big believer in quantity will find quality. So if you can be getting bit over and over again, building confidence, catching these fish of all sizes, but not eliminating size of fish from getting bit, eventually you're going to get into finding something in fishing that is just perfect for you. And so for trout, this is the way in, is inline spinners, 1/8 of an ounce, 1/16 of an ounce. The only thing with the inline spinners, as opposed to the shave metal baits, that are also going to be just your easiest. Like I said, if I was going to use 2 baits that I had to take anywhere to trout fish in the state, it's going to be this brown, what's labeled as grasshopper, and it's a Warden's Yakima bait rooster tail. I like a 1/16 of an ounce, but an 1/8 of an ounce is fine as well. And then super duper prism light gold. And I like a 501, but a 502 or 503 is going to work fine as well. But those would be my 2 have to use baits if I had to take anything to go trout fishing. I have so much confidence in those catching fish, watching others catch fish with them. Those are just the two go-tos. And then with your inline spinner, unlike your shaved metal, the one thing you do have to pay attention to when you fish these is that when you cast upstream, if you're going to go 45 degrees, which is where you should be looking to target, 45 degrees upstream, cross current, working your way through the different sections of river. I typically like to wade upstream as opposed to downstream. So I'm going to start at my tail outs. I'm going to work my way into the run. I'm going to fish whatever the shallow side is first, work my way up the shallow side, come back, work my way through, getting deeper, getting farther across current, and just pick apart every section of a run that I can. An entire section of river, I want to make a cast to every single spot of it without trying to spook as many fish as possible. So the easiest way to do that is just to fish from behind them and fan cast your way up, starting with the shallow side, work your way across river, and then repeat as you start moving up the river and just fan cast your way. But when you cast these little rooster tails 45 degrees upstream, sometimes the current or you getting on your reel don't match up very well, and that blade will suck right up against the body. And you'll go to reel it in, and it's just going to kind of be doing this on the way in. It's not going to work as it was intended, which is nice and steady on a tight line with the blade rotating around the inline spinner. It's not offset. So it's rotating around the shank of, the shaft of the lure. So what you can do when you cast it up, the second it hits the water and you go to snap your bail or you go to engage your reel to get going and close that bail, just give a quick hook set. Doesn't need to be hard or violent like you would be if you were, if a fish you go to set a hook. You're just trying to flick your wrist in a hook setting manner. And what that's going to do is it ensures when it hits the water, it gives it enough forward force to get the blade in tension in the current because the current is behind it. So that means that if you're not reeling fast enough, the current will overtake the forward motion. It will no longer have the tension needed for that blade to spin around and work. So what you want to do when fishing inline spinners, because they are deadly effective, when you cast upriver, give that flick. You should be feeling a steady vibration on the rod tip the entire way in. If it ever feels like it's kind of loose, like you're reeling, you could feel there's something there, but you're not getting any vibration. There's one of 2 things that probably happened. The line has either wrapped around the back of the treble hook. So your line has somehow gotten back behind and it's stuck to the line. So it's not able to operate correctly. That's probably going to feel more of a heavy feeling on the rod tip because you're pulling through more. There's more water resistance. The other thing that would have happened is that the current overtook your pace, the speed that you were retrieving in. It stopped the blade. It stuck the blade to the lure. And that's going to feel like, there's still weight on your line, but it's almost going to feel like you're reeling in slack line, like there's nothing there anymore. So you want to just feel that constant, steady pulse on the end. And again, just like the metal shaved baits, rear facing hook that's loose from the rest of the bait. So it can move around, so it can be struck at from different angles. And that hook point, they're all trebles, 3 points, lots of opportunities to turn those bites into successful hookups and then turn them into successful landings, which then, you're going to get what you wanted out of your fishing trip, whether it be you're catching them to eat or keep or to release. So getting from, point A to point B, that is the easiest way that we can get there is with our bait and then with our inline spinners. If you do happen to be a fly angler, like I said, we're dealing with some fish that have been there long enough that they may take on wild tendencies. They will start to learn their habitat. They'll start to learn the natural food sources that exist there. And they may be more keen to target very specifically designed flies or lures that mimic one thing in particular. The great thing about the baits that we just showed, they can mimic a lot of different things. And I'm a big advocate in that in fishing, especially with new beginner or budding anglers that are looking to build confidence, looking to catch fish. You need those bites to achieve that ultimately. And so we're looking for baits always that mimic the most amount of things. What do you get the most bang out of your buck for? And inline spinners, shaved pieces of metal, you're just getting, it's not a swim bait. It's not just like we're targeting fish that are eating on 1.5-inch shad. And that's exactly what we're doing. And if we're wrong, if they're not feeding on 1.5-inch shad, we're throwing a bait that is more than likely not going to get bit as often. So by utilizing baits that are kind of multi-purpose, that have multiple things that they could be, you're just going to get bit more often. So same thing goes with fly fishing on the lower Illinois more often than not. Sticking to things like naturally colored streamers or woolly buggers, preferably with like rubber legs. If you're going to nymph, very basic nymphs. We have caddis, we have mayflies. These fish were raised in hatcheries in the region of our country in which they're seeing similar bugs. Keep it very basic, size 14 to 18 pheasant tails, prince nymphs, rubber-legged yellow sallies, rubber-legged nymph like prince nymphs and pheasant tail nymphs. Rubber legs, always just add a little bit extra in there so that you have that. You're not just trying to match the exact stage of the larva at that time of year because those fish are so keyed in on them. You may try midges up in the film. If you do, you will see rising fish occasionally. A lot of the times, though, midges are going to be more successful than trying to match a dry caddis or mayfly hatch. But if you do, sticking with very generic, mayfly and caddis hatches. So your size 14 to size 18 caddises, size 18 to size 22 mayflies. With your mayfly sticking with a lighter colored body, like a gray or light blue or a yellow, maybe with some purple mixed in with some like ripple flash, little tuft post on them. The smaller, the better. Same thing goes with caddis flies, sticking with a olive or some type of drab yellow tan body. And the smaller you can throw, the better. If you're going to try to get them to come up to the top in the wintertime, try to get those dries as small as possible if you do see them rising. But more often than not, swinging an articulated fly that's a smaller size, that's just in a natural color, or just a rubber-legged woolly bugger in olive or brown or black or white. Those are just going to pick up more bites more often. It doesn't mean that you can't really specialize into fly fishing on the river for those fish that have been in there for a long time and do key in very heavily when there is a particular type of bug in the water or a hatch going on, and they do key in on that. But for all intents and purposes, getting out there at finding success immediately out on the river, whether you're fly fishing, using artificial lures, or using any type of bait, these are really going to be your most basic setup. Same thing goes for bait. You could use corn, you could use worms, crickets, grasshoppers, anything like that. They will catch fish eventually, but these are the easiest things that you have the most availability to. I'll go ahead and throw the trout angler guide over here in the chat if you haven't received that in your email or been to our website recently. And this is going to list other areas in the state. It'll include the lower Illinois, and it's just going to break down a lot of the things that you might need to be successful if you're going to somewhere you haven't been before. List things like camping areas and that are nearby, bait and tackle stores that are in the area. Gore is obviously a trout fishing town, so any of the stuff that I showed today or talked about, more than likely you're going to be able to find there at one of your local Gore bait and tackle shops. And then as far as my info goes, if you receive the link to this through email, you have my information. Otherwise, you can go to wildlifedepartment.com, go to our fishing resources page, scroll down to the bottom. My info is there. Email, phone number, call, text, send me an email. It's what I'm here for. Try to get you guys on as many fish, find things that you like. If you ever like these Asking Anglers and want something more as far as a species or a body of water or something that we haven't talked about, let us know. These are designed for anglers. They're meant to provide basic and intermediate information to put you on as many fish as quickly as possible. And if for some reason someday you get that fishing bug real bad and you want to start breaking off into the more specialty groups, we're here to help with that. And we can certainly get you pointed in the right direction for good Oklahoma fishing. And so anything that we can ever do to help out with that, please let us know. So that brings us up on the 2-hour mark. Appreciate you guys being here. If you're interested in the Lower Mountain Fork, we're going live again at 3 o'clock. So if you didn't register for that, just come back to our Outdoor Oklahoma page and look at our upcoming live features. So for that, have safe holidays and enjoy the trout fishing, and we'll see you at the next one.